Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to be reading you 4 ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. Spellbinder, Montreal, Quebec. Francois Charles Havard de Beaufort, a soldier from France stationed in Montreal, was always on the lookout for ways to make some extra money. For a small fee, he would impress folks with his card tricks and his knife-handling skills. He had also built a reputation as a sorcerer able to cast magic spells, a practice that Catholic bishops and priests in New France associated with witchcraft and saw as the work of the devil. But one fateful night in 1742, Havard de Beaufort's magic powers appeared to abandon him. A Montreal shoemaker named Charles Robidoux had been robbed of 300 livres, worth several $1,000s these days, and the thief was still at large. Could it have been someone he knew? Desperate to recover his money, Robidoux turned to the young soldier for help. For a fee, Havard de Beaufort said he would expose the thief's identity by casting a spell to make the culprit's face appear in a mirror. On June 28, 1742, the sorcerer showed up at Robidoux's house. He asked for a table on which he placed candles, a Catholic prayer book, olive oil, gunpowder, and a mirror. Over the next hour or so, he read passages from the prayer book in Latin, burned bits of paper in the candle flames, and smeared oil and powder on the mirror in an attempt to conjure up the face of the culprit. The pops, flames, and incantations awed everyone present, but they didn't produce a vision of the thief. In a last-ditch effort to expose the criminal, perhaps among those gathered in Robidoux's parlor, Havard de Beaufort picked up a nearby crucifix, dabbed it with oil, exposed it to the flames, and read more sacred prayers aloud. Nothing. Try as he might, he could weave no terrifying magic spell that night. But the punishment he received for the methods he used was pretty horrific. The next day, when someone reported what he had done, Havard de Beaufort was arrested and tossed into jail, charged with profaning or disgracefully insulting the words of the Holy Scripture and with inappropriate and evil use of holy object, the crucifix. In August, after a long trial, Havard de Beaufort was found guilty of these crimes. He was banished from New France and sentenced to 3 years of slave labor in the galleys of the ships belonging to the King of France. But before he was forced aboard to begin serving his sentence, he had to appear in front of the parish church of Montreal in nothing but a long shirt, carrying a heavy lighted candle and wearing a sign that read, "Profaner of Holy Things." Then he was tied to a wooden frame, dragged from one city crossroad to another, and whipped in front of jeering crowds. An evening of sorcery had terrifying consequences, ones that Havard de Beaufort would never have imagined. Powerless to save himself, even with magic, he was deported back to France in the autumn of 1742 and was never heard from again. The Grey Man, Montreal, Quebec. 55 years had passed since Toronto children's author Sarah Harriott first saw the Grey Man, but she still remembered it like yesterday. She and her family, parents, 3 older brothers, and an older sister were living in a ground floor apartment in a house on Montreal's Rue Saint-Urbain back then in the 1940s. Sarah was 7 at the time, and she and her mother were the only ones at home. She had stretched out on the floor in her brother's bedroom, contentedly coloring a picture of a flag when a soft "oh no" from the kitchen made her pause. She figured her mother had probably just dropped something, so she wasn't worried. But she did look away from her picture and toward the open bedroom door. That's when she saw him, a man wearing a suit and a hat, walking slowly past the doorway down the hall, toward the dining room. He didn't look familiar. His footsteps were silent, and his overall shape appeared grayish and almost translucent. In 2004, Harriet would recall how her 7-year-old self had thought he seemed see-through-ish. Not sure what she had just seen, and not wanting to upset her mom, she kept the spooky appearance of the gray man to herself. The second time Sarah saw him, her family had just returned home from a day trip in her father's old Ford. It was a warm summer evening, and a gentle rain was falling. As her dad pulled up in front of the house, he suddenly announced that everyone had to stay in the car. Harriet recalled spending a long time in the hot and crowded Ford that night before her father finally let them get out. She also clearly remembered looking out a rain-spattered window and seeing the gray man standing at the front door of her house. Again, Sarah said nothing about seeing him, and her father said nothing about why he kept his family in the car. Another time, though, when something very spooky happened in the house, Sarah's dad did speak about it. The family was gathered around the dining room table for the evening Passover meal, or Seder, when a knife suddenly rose up from the table and dropped back down on a special food-laden plate, cracking it in half. In a fear-filled voice, Sarah's father uttered one unforgettable sentence: "Satan is in this house." Then he insisted that the ceremonial meal continue as if nothing had happened. Looking back on that night as an adult, Harriet wondered if some otherworldly presence had been in the house for a long time, and that was why the landlord had kept the rent so low. A few years after the Seder supper incident, Sarah and one of her brothers were talking about an article in the weekend newspaper about ghosts and hauntings. A sidebar to the article mentioned that ghosts occasionally appeared as rectangular illuminations. "I saw that," Sarah blurted out, and told her brother about how she had woken up one night to see a rectangle of light on the wall. Curious, she got out of bed, climbed up on the dresser, and held her hand in front of the bright shape to see if her hand cast a shadow. If it did, she remembered thinking she would know that the light was bouncing off a mirror or getting in past the window, blind in some strange way. But her hand cast no shadow. The light seemed to be coming from the wall itself. Sarah scrambled down from the dresser and headed to her parents' bedroom. When she told her mother what she had seen, her mother said that she must have been dreaming and let her snuggle in beside her for the rest of the night. After Sarah told her brother about the ghostly light, she found the courage to mention the gray man. To her amazement, he admitted that he had seen him too. Then he told her about a frightening experience he'd had after coming home from school one afternoon. He had just opened the door when he felt a cold hand clamp his clammy fingers around his wrist. He wrenched his hand away, slammed the door behind him, and ran all the way to their grandmother's house 6 blocks away. Beyond by the knowledge that they had both encountered the gray man, the siblings finally decided to tell their mother about him. She was shocked to learn that they had seen him, confessing that he had often appeared in the kitchen, but that she hadn't wanted to frighten anyone by talking about him. In 1954, when Sarah was 12, her family moved out of the house on Rue Saint-Urbain. On moving day, just before the truck loaded with their possessions was about to leave, Sarah and the brother who had been gripped by the ghostly hand were taking one last look around so make sure they had left nothing behind. As they were leaving one room, her brother reached for the light switch on the wall, but he never got to flip it off. Suddenly, the light went on its own. Maybe, Harriet remembered thinking at the time, this was the gray man's way of saying goodbye. Ghost Sailors of the Charles Haskell, Grand Banks, Newfoundland and Labrador. 17-year-old George W. Scott was one of 3 Nova Scotians aboard the American-built schooner Charles Haskell when it sailed for the cod-rich Grand Banks in March 1866. The rest of the crew was from Gloucester, Massachusetts. On March 6th, with a fierce storm brewing, the Haskell's captain decided to make for George's Bank at the southwest end of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and Labrador. There the water would be shallow enough to drop anchor and ride out the storm. Dozens of other schooners' captains had made the same decision, and by midnight most of the North Atlantic fishing fleet in the area was anchored by George's. But as wave after monstrous wave battered the ships, one broke free of its anchor, and with the wind as its pilot, sailed right toward the Charles Haskell. In a desperate attempt to avoid a collision, the Haskell's captain gave the order to cut the anchor rope. With barely a minute to spare, his ship drifted out of harm's way. But it too was now out of control and heading straight to another anchored schooner, the Andrew Jackson. In every other instance of two ships ramming each other in such a storm, both had been doomed. But in the early hours of March 7, 1866, when these two schooners collided, the Andrew Jackson sank with all hands on board, and the Charles Haskell stayed afloat, with its crew members left horrified but uninjured. The damaged Haskell eventually made it safely back to port for repairs, but young Scott and the rest of the crew refused to sail on her again. There had been many rumors she was cursed even before her maiden voyage. Apparently a member of the shipbuilding team who was working on her just before she was launched fell and broke his neck. Local sailors saw his death as a bad omen, a sign of a troubled future. So after the sinking of the Andrew Jackson, the owner of the Charles Haskell had an even harder time finding a captain and crew for her. A few months later, though, the schooner was back at sea fishing for cod. One night while sailing over George's Bank with no other ships nearby, two hands on deck got the fright of their lives. As they stared in horror, several oilskin-clad men climbed up the other side. They were dripping wet and their faces looked gray in the moonlight. Without a word, they started moving around as if they were casting fish nets into the sea. The two horrified men called out to their mates below, and when the rest of the crew stumbled up on deck, they too saw the ghostly crew at work. After a few minutes, and mysteriously as they had approached, the phantoms slipped back over the rail and into the icy Atlantic waters below. There's an old superstition that someone who drowns at sea will come back to the ship he was on, if it ever returns to the place where he died. The doomed crew of the Andrew Jackson would never return to their ship. The sea had swallowed it up. But when the ship that had sent them to their watery graves sailed over the spot where they had drowned, they boarded it instead. That, according to the crew of the Charles Haskell, was the only possible explanation for the nightmarish scene that had unfolded before them as they drifted over George's Bank. When his men calmed down enough to set the sails, the Haskell's captain ordered them to change course and make for home. Safe in port, they shared their terrifying story with anyone who would listen. Over the next 100 or so years, it would be immortalized in poems and songs. The first, most likely being a ballad that appeared in 1874, a poem by Harry L. Marcy called The Ghostly Crew, was included in Fishermen's Ballads and Songs of the Sea, published by Proctor Brothers of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Its 20 verses are written on the first person as if Haskell crew member were telling the tale. The 8th stanza refers to the earlier accident. The trip before our schooner, she was on George's then, ran down another vessel and sunk her and her men. 2 stanzas later, the sailor narrator begins to describe how the horrifying scene unfolded. For the dim dark watches I felt a chilly dread come on me, just as if I heard one calling from the dead. And o'er our rail were clambered, all silent one by one, a dozen dripping sailors. Just wait till I am done. Right on to deck they clambered, and not a voice we heard. They moved about before us and never spoke a word. Their faces pale and sea-wet shone ghostly through the night. Each took his place as fairly as if they had a right. After describing how the sea-drenched fishermen went about their work, the poem sums up what the Charles Haskell's crew must have felt that fateful night. But 'twas the same poor fellows, I thank God rest their souls, that our old craft ran under that time on George's shoals. And there you have my story, and 'twas just as I say, and I've believed in spirits since that time anyway. After that night on board the Kerr schooner with the Phantom crew, the Haskell's men certainly must have shared the feelings of the poem's narrator. Even if they hadn't believed in spirits before the trip, they did afterwards, and they believed that the ghosts were the spirits of the drowned seamen from the Andrew Jackson. A Mother's Nightmare, Trinity Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador. Over the centuries, powerful North Atlantic storms have claimed the lives of many brave, hard-working maritimers. No one was more aware of this than Mary Crew, who lived in a small outport community on Trinity Bay, in Newfoundland. She had nearly lost her husband, Reuben, in 1911, when the sealing ship he was on sank in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Sealing was dangerous work and involved leaving the safety of a ship to go out on the ice and hunt the animals that were such an important source of food, skins and oil, and of wages that were needed to buy other supplies. After his brush with death, Crew had given up such work, and for that Mary was very grateful. But in March 1914, her 16-year-old son Albert John announced that he'd been offered a job on the sealing ship Newfoundland, and that he really wanted to take it. Not only could Mary not change his mind, but she also had to accept her husband's decision to go with him. She understood how much he wanted to try to protect Albert from the dangers he knew the young men might face. As she would later tell her daughter, Mary awoke suddenly one night to see her beloved husband and son kneeling beside her bed. Their heads were bowed in prayer and they appeared calm. But seeing them like this started Mary's heart pounding. Reuben and Albert John weren't home that night. They were out among the ice floes, working off the Newfoundland, or so she thought. What happened to the Newfoundland sealers after the wooden ship became trapped in the ice on March 30th, 1914, is recorded in the reports of 3 hearings held to investigate the tragedy. The icy grip closing in on the ship, the sealers being sent off it to walk 12 to 15 kilometers to another ship, the Stefano, that had reported seeing seals, the blinding blizzard, the confusion and miscommunication. These had many other horrific details are included in those reports. So are the names of the 78 men who either drowned or froze to death during the most tragic sealing disaster in Newfoundland Labrador's history. Reuben and Albert John's names are on that list. Their frozen bodies were found on the ice. They were holding on to each other as if to keep warm, and there was a look of calm on their faces. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.